Hello everyone, it's Michelle here, and today I'm showing you how I made 4 cards for the Altenew Educator certification program. Now these 2 cards I've already made, and I realised that after I made them I forgot to take process photos along the way. So I'm making 2 more cards and I'm going to show you exactly how I made them. The major difference between the first 2 and these ones that I'm going to make now is the cardstock that I use. So this one I'm using Strathmore Bristol, the other one I used Canson watercolour paper. So I'm starting with actually a discontinued stamp set from Altenew. This is a study in watercolour, and for this first card I'm going to be using shades of blue. So I started with some tumbled glass, and then I'm actually putting some salty ocean in there, and I'm spraying that with my little water sprayer, and I'm just dunking the cardstock into that colour. I'm not particularly aiming to get colour all over it. I'm aiming to get a little bit of variation of colour here and there, and I'm just drying it off with my heat tool. And now I'm going to try and flatten it out as best I can so that it'll stick nicely in my Misty and I can get some good impressions with these stamps. So once I've got it nice and stuck down, I'm adding some Versamark ink to my stamps, and I'm making sure to press really well. I actually did that twice, and now I'm using some Hero Arts clear embossing powder to cover all of that stamping. Now you can see when I hold it up where that embossing powder is. It's not always the easiest to see because the background's a little bit blotchy. I'm just going to funnel all of my embossing powder back into the tub and then melt the embossing powder with my heat tool. Now, that's round 1, and you can see that embossing there. Now, a major difference between using this Strathmore Bristol and the watercolour paper is that the watercolour paper is quite textured, whereas the Bristol is a lot smoother. So I managed to get much more smooth embossing on these cards than I did on the first 2. Now, the second round of ink smushing, I used some Salty Ocean, but also some Blueprint Sketch Distress Oxide inks, and I just smushed my panel into the ink, and again with the heat tool to make sure it's all nice and dry. Now, some patches, you can see there are little bits of ink on top of the embossing. I just wiped that away with a damp baby wipe, but I didn't really wipe away anything that was not on the embossing. I just made sure it was dry. So again, I got the difference in the depth of colour. Now, I don't know if you can notice, but I've actually put this panel back into the Misty, but upside down. So the stamps are actually in exactly the same spot that they were previously. I've just flipped my panel around by 180 degrees so that these images will overlap, but not perfectly. They'll be a little bit off centre and sort of backwards. Again, I've added some more clear embossing powder, and now I am heat setting that, making sure all the embossing powder is melted, and it becomes a little bit tricky at this stage because there's already melted embossing powder there, and then there's unmelted embossing powder on top, so I had to look really carefully to make sure it actually melted it all. Now for this last round, I am using Prize Ribbon and also a little bit of Chip Sapphire ink to just get a really nice dark blue happening in those few gaps that are left between the embossing that's over the pale blue and the embossing that's over the mid blue. There's just a few gaps here and there where I'm making it dark blue. So I'm getting lots of depth of colour here, and what it ends up looking like is my own custom pattern paper, and I just love this look. I think it's really cool, and I think I might be trying it with a few more different stamp sets that I have. Again, I will use a baby wipe to wipe over the embossing to just get rid of any little splotches that are on top of the embossing powder, but make sure I dry all the rest that's actually on cardstock so I get the depth of colour. Now, here's the process all over again. I'm just going to speed this one up just a little bit. So this time I'm using some purples, and with the purples I started with milled lavender and shaded lilac, and I quite liked the effect that I got here by the way that I pulled the piece of cardstock up. You can see all those little lines. I really like that. So yeah, ink, dry the ink, stamp with Versamark, put on the embossing powder, heat up the embossing powder, repeat. But with different colours. So this first layer, those two ink colours, the milled lavender almost looks pink up against the shaded lilac, which is a much more bluey purple. The milled lavender is much more pinky purple. And then the next layer, I'm using seedless preserves and wilted violet. And I really liked this combination. I really like how sort of red and warm the seedless preserves is up against the wilted violet. But I kind of wished that I just used the seedless preserves for this layer. And I'll tell you why when I get to the next layer. So again, I dried off the panel. I stamped it with Versamark and made sure I flipped my cardstock around so that the stamps were upside down compared to the first stamping. Adding my embossing powder, and you can see how the embossing powder is going on the opposite direction to the previous stamps. Heat it up with my heat tool, and you can see all that embossing powder melting. And then the last layer, I'm actually using both wilted violet and villainous potion, and I really didn't really need to use the wilted violet here because I really needed the depth of colour from the villainous potion. So the fact that there was already some wilted violet in the previous layer meant that there wasn't as much difference between the second layer and the third. So yeah, if I did this again, I'd just use seedless preserves in the second layer and I'd just use villainous potion in the third. Okay, now another decorative item I'm using on these cards is these layering stamps. And I'm just using the leaves from this one. This is from the Beautiful Day stamp set, which has this gorgeous rose, but I'm just using the leaves. And I'm just using two of the stamps from the leaves. There is actually an outline stamp, but I've ignored that for the purposes of this card. I've just done the solid layer in the background, which I've done with my palest colours in both the blue and the purple. And then I used their darkest or darker colour for the detail layer. And then I just ran it through with my Scout die cutting machine with the coordinating dies, and so I've got heaps and heaps of these leaves to be working with. So for the blue card, I decided to use a stamp from the Label Love stamp set. This stamp set is really cool. It looks like a really old-fashioned Dymo label, and I really love it. I decided to use some Pink Fresh Studio ink. This one is Sapphire, which is just a gorgeous blue, for that sentiment. For the purple card, I decided to actually white emboss my sentiment, and the sentiment I'm using from the Billowing Peonies, I think it's called, I think I've got that right, stamp set. All the products will be linked below, so if you want to have a look. And I've done this on some iris cardstock from Hero Arts, which I thought would coordinate really nicely with those dark purples in my panel. So with this time, I'm using white embossing powder. Now I'm cutting down this sentiment from the Label Love set. Now with these cards, Altenew set me a challenge, and I needed to make 4 masculine cards, so that's why there's no flowers on these cards, and why I've kept them pretty much monochromatic. See, I'm going around the edge of this label with my Copic marker in a similar colour, just sort of tidies up the edges where you've cut it. Anyway, I was asked to make 4 different sentiments on my cards. So that's why I have one card that says, we are better together. So that's an anniversary card. One card that says, love you. One card that says, you are awesome, which is an encouragement card. And also a happy birthday card. So I've got 4 masculine cards. But for all of them, I've got the background is created in the same way. The leaves are created in the same way, but I wanted to try and get quite different layouts of the cards. So with this blue one, I decided to create a sort of chevron look, sort of like V-shaped arrows coming from one side of the card. And then I thought I'd have some of these leaves sort of popping out from underneath that those V shapes, and you'll actually thank me because I cut out a good 5 minutes from this video of me just rearranging these leaves from underneath this V shape. It took me so long to figure out where I wanted them to go, but we got there eventually. But yeah, the video would have been a whole lot longer if you'd seen all of the just reorganization over and over again. It took me ages. Now, because I am using the Strathmore Bristol and I've used lots of water on this panel, it is a bit warped. So whenever I have a panel that is a bit warped because of lots of water, I tend to pull out the big guns in terms of adhesive. So I'm using my Scotch ATG, which has a really strong adhesive in it. And you would have seen that I added a whole lot of adhesive over the top of that. Okay, so to add the sentiment, I pulled out some of my Altenew foam tape and popped that up just a little bit. So for this card, I decided to go a little bit different. I cut my watercoloured and embossed panel down so that there was a lovely white border. I always like white space on my cards. And then I decided to sort of create a halo of leaves around my sentiment. I cut the sentiment panel down so it was approximately square. I don't know if it was actually square. It was close enough. And I cut down these leaves so that I'm just dealing with the 3 leaves at the tip of the branch, and I arrange them to go in a halo around that love you sentiment. Now, when I did that, I thought that was fine, but when I put it on top of the panel that I'd made, they kind of got a bit lost. There wasn't enough contrast between the leaves around the love you and the background. See what I mean? They sort of get lost. So I decided to grab some more of that iris cardstock that I had stamped the sentiment onto, and I layered it onto that square, and I like that a whole heap better. It just gave a little bit of a bit more contrast between the background and the purple panel, and then between the purple panel and the leaves. It meant the leaves stood out a lot more. All right, now I added a whole lot of foam adhesive on the back of these leaves and the love you sentiment, and then popped that down and I was done. So here's all 4 cards together. You can see the layout of all 4 cards is quite different to each other. The colours are obviously different to each other, but the components of the cards are the same. So I hope you enjoyed seeing my process video. I will have another card coming for Altenew Challenge for Level 2, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. Bye.